The snow fell in thick, unforgiving curtains, burying the world in a silence that pressed down like a shroud. She lay half-buried in a drift against the skeletal remains of a fallen pine, her breath shallow gasps that plumed faintly in the frigid air. Her face, when he found it beneath the ice-rimmed hood of a tattered cloak, was a mask of blue-white bone and raw terror, eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on the swirling gray sky. He had been tracking nothing in particular, just the whisper of the wind, the promise of a trapped hare or a squirrel foolish enough to venture out. He was a man used to the empty places, to the quiet companionship of frost and stone. His own face was weathered into lines as deep and unyielding as the land itself. His eyes the color of winter ice, betraying little. He saw the frozen tracks nearby, too many boots, too much haste. He saw the torn fabric, the disturbed snow, the faint, coppery stain half hidden by the fresh fall. He understood without needing details. Another harsh story etched onto the landscape. His first instinct, honed by years of solitary survival, was caution. This was not his fight, not his burden. The wilderness demanded self-preservation above all else. But the raw, animal fear in her eyes, even dimmed by the encroaching cold, snagged something deep within him, a flicker of recognition for a vulnerability he'd seen in different forms, in different places, all brutal. He knelt slowly, his movements economical and deliberate. No sudden gestures to startle a wounded creature. He checked for breath, faint but there. He saw the signs of a struggle recent and brutal. He saw the way she flinched even in her stupor when his shadow fell over her. He was a shadow himself, in truth, a man who moved unseen, preferring the company of the trees to the clamor of settlements. His name, Silas, was rarely spoken aloud. He considered leaving her. It would be the practical choice. She was near death, damaged in ways that went beyond the obvious. Taking her to his cabin, his only sanctuary, meant inviting the outside world in, a world he had deliberately shed like a heavy skin years ago. It meant risk, but the wind howled, promising death within hours, and her eyes, haunted and broken, seemed to plead not for rescue, perhaps, but simply for an end to the suffering that had brought her to this place. He was not a compassionate man, not in the way the world understood it. Compassion was a luxury the frontier rarely afforded. But there was a grim necessity, a refusal to let the wolves, literal or otherwise, have the final claim on a human soul while breath still clung to it. He made his decision, a silent pact with the indifferent sky. Carefully, he lifted her, surprised by the lightness of her wasted frame. Her body was rigid with cold, but a faint tremor ran through her. She made no sound, not even a whimper, as he adjusted her weight, wrapping his own spare blanket around her frail form. The long walk back to his cabin began, the snow swirling thicker, his boots leaving the only fresh tracks in the silent, deadly white. He did not look back. The world she had fled was fading behind them, swallowed by the storm. The cabin was small, built from rough-hewn logs, squat and almost invisible against the side of a rise. Inside, it was Spartan but warm, the air thick with the scent of pine smoke and drying herbs. A banked fire glowed in the hearth, its warmth a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Silas laid her gently on his narrow cot, near the fire. He worked methodically, removing the frozen cloak, easing off her boots. Her clothes were thin, torn in places, stained with mud and darker, older marks. Her body was a map of recent history, bruises, cuts, the telltale signs of rough handling. He was a man of action, not words, and certainly not of fuss. He fetched clean water from the bucket by the door, heated some in a pot over the fire. With a cloth, he gently cleaned her face, wiping away the grime and ice. She remained silent, eyes still wide and vacant, though they now flickered occasionally, tracking the movement of shadows on the ceiling, or perhaps the ghosts only she could see. He gave her a few sips of water, then a little warmed broth, holding the cup steady. She swallowed mechanically, without protest or acknowledgement. He changed her into some of his own clothes, oversized and rough but clean and dry. The simple act felt strange. Intimate in a way he wasn't used to. He avoided looking at her directly, focusing on the task, his movements steady. He bandaged a gash on her arm, noting the tremble that ran through her even when he was most careful. She was like a wild animal caught in a snare, physically present but mentally miles away, trapped in a terror he could only guess at. He sat back on his stool, watching her. The firelight cast dancing shadows, softening the harsh lines of the cabin, but doing little to soften the stark reality of her presence. She was breathing easier now, the warmth coaxing some color back into her cheeks. But the fear remained, a palpable thing in the quiet room. He did not ask her name. He did not ask what had happened. There was time for that, or there wasn't. For now, there was only the fire, the quiet ticking of the cold outside, and the fragile life flickering on his cot. He made himself a simple meal, ate it in silence, never taking his attention entirely off her. He expected her to stir, perhaps cry out, but she remained lost in her internal landscape. He added more wood to the fire, the crackling sound loud in the stillness. He wrapped himself in a blanket and settled into his chair by the hearth, prepared to keep vigil. Sleep would come eventually, but not until he was sure she wouldn't disappear back into the night, or simply cease to breathe. He was a custodian of this small, unexpected life, a role he had never sought. He thought of the tracks outside, the violence they implied. It wasn't over for her. It might not be over for him either, now that he was involved. But looking at her, the rise and fall of her chest beneath the rough fabric, the faint tremor that still sometimes shook her limbs, he knew he wouldn't turn her out. Not yet, perhaps not ever. The silence stretched, filled only by the sounds of the fire and the gentle rhythm of two people simply existing in the same small space. One adrift, one anchored by necessity. Days bled into a week. She began to stir more, her eyes losing some of their vacant stare, though wariness remained etched deep within them. She ate when he offered food, small portions at first, then more substantial ones. She spoke her first words on the third day, a soft, hesitant whisper. "Where?" He answered simply, "My cabin." "You were out in the snow." She didn't ask anything further. Not then. Her name, she eventually murmured, was Ilara. Just Ilara. She flinched violently at sudden noises. A branch snapping outside, the wind whistling through a crack. Her hands trembled constantly. Sleep seemed to bring her little peace, filled with silent nightmares that made her whole body tense, though she rarely cried out. Silas continued his routine, hunting, trapping, chopping wood, melting snow for water. He moved with quiet efficiency, respecting the vast distance she held between herself and the world. He didn't pry. His presence was steady, non-demanding. He simply was there. Slowly, tentatively, Ilara began to emerge from her shell. She started watching his movements, her eyes following him around the cabin. One morning, she rose from the cot, her legs shaky, and stood by the fire, holding her hands out to the warmth. It was the first time she had shown any independent action. Later, she attempted to help, stacking the small pile of split kindling by the hearth. Her movements were clumsy, her strength diminished, but the effort was there. Silas merely nodded, acknowledging her contribution without excessive praise or attention. This quiet acceptance seemed to be what she needed. Little by little, the color returned to her face, the haunted look in her eyes replaced by a deep, abiding sadness, but also a flicker of resilience. She started speaking more, not about the past, but about the present, the biting cold, the taste of the stew, the way the firelight danced on the wall. Small, safe observations. Silas listened, offering brief, non-committal responses. One evening, huddled by the fire, she spoke of the snow outside, how it seemed to swallow sound, how it felt like the world had ended and they were the only two left. Her voice was soft, almost a murmur. "It's a kind of peace," she said, looking into the flames. After noise, she trailed off, her gaze distant. Silas understood. He knew the kind of noise she meant. the kind that echoed long after the sounds had faded. He offered her a cup of warmed berry tea. She took it with hands that still trembled but were steadier than before. "Thank you," she said, and this time her eyes met his for a brief moment. In that shared glance something shifted. Not trust, not yet, but a recognition of their shared reality in this isolated cabin, survivors against the indifferent elements and the shadows that pursued them. She was no longer just a broken thing he had found in the snow. She was Alara, a woman finding her footing again on treacherous ground. And he, the solitary man, found his solitude was now layered with a quiet, unexpected responsibility that felt less like a burden and more like purpose. The change in the weather came first, a brutal wind that howled down from the peaks, shaking the cabin walls and driving snow into every crack. It was a storm that threatened to bury them alive, cutting them off completely. As Silas worked to reinforce the cabin, banking snow high against the walls, Alara helped where she could, her hands raw and clumsy, but determined. She carried logs, hammered in loose boards, her previous fragility replaced by a fierce, quiet energy. She no longer flinched as often at sudden noises. Instead, her gaze became sharp, watchful. The harsh environment was forging something new within her, tempering the fear with necessity. One evening, as they huddled closer to the fire, the wind a monstrous roar outside, she finally spoke of what had happened. Her voice was low, hesitant at first, then gaining a quiet strength as she recounted the events that had led her to the snowdrift. Not graphic details, but the betrayal, the violence, the escape, the desperate flight through the frozen wilderness with the sound of pursuit echoing in her mind. She spoke of loss or of home, of people, of the life she had known. Silas listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. When she finished, the quiet returned, heavier now with the weight of her confession. He simply added another log to the fire. "They were looking for you," he said, his voice gravelly. It wasn't a question. Alara nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. They would have cleaned things up. The unspoken hung in the air. He knew. People like that left no witnesses, no loose ends. "Are they still looking?" he asked. Alara hesitated. "I don't know. I disappeared in the storm. Maybe they think I'm dead," but her eyes, meeting his again, held the flicker of doubt, of lingering fear. The storm outside raged, a physical manifestation of the turmoil she carried within. It also served as a temporary shield, burying their tracks deeper, making travel impossible for anyone who might be searching. But storms ended. The following days tested their resilience. The snow was too deep to hunt effectively. Resources dwindled. They rationed their meager supplies. It was a different kind of threat, slower, more insidious than pursuit. Survival became a shared project, a silent partnership forged in hardship. Alara, surprisingly, took on more responsibility. She learned to mend her clothes, to conserve fuel, to stretch their food. She even learned to use the small axe, splitting kindling with careful, deliberate strokes. The physical labor grounded her, giving her body a purpose beyond flight or fear. Her internal monologue, once dominated by terror and despair, now included thoughts of practicality, of tomorrow, of the next meal. She watched Silas, learning his quiet methods, the way he read the subtle signs of the wilderness. She was becoming not just a survivor of human cruelty, but a survivor of the land itself. The bond between them remained largely unspoken, expressed in shared glances, small considerations of him making sure she had the warmest spot by the fire, her saving him the choicest piece of dried meat. It was a bond built on necessity, respect, and the shared understanding that they were two solitary figures against a vast, indifferent world, who had found a fragile strength in each other's quiet company. The thaw came gradually, a slow drip from the eaves, a softening of the snowpack. With the thaw came the inevitable. Silas found the tracks 2 miles out, half melted but unmistakable. 2 horses, 2 riders, moving slowly but surely. They were circling, searching. He returned to the cabin, his face grim. Alara saw it immediately. "They're still looking," she stated, her voice steady, devoid of the panic that would have consumed her weeks ago. Silas nodded. They know you headed this way. The storm slowed them, but it didn't stop them. He looked at her, a long, assessing gaze. The fragile woman he had found was gone, replaced by someone with a hardened core, eyes that had seen the worst and refused to break. We can stay here, he said. It's defensible, but they might burn us out or they could run. But running hadn't saved her the first time. This time, perhaps, they could stand. Alara looked around the small cabin, her sanctuary, the place where she had begun to heal. Running meant losing this fragile peace, returning to the constant terror of the road. Staying meant confronting the source of her nightmare. Her hand went instinctively to the axe handle leaning by the door. Felt solid, real. She looked at Silas, at the quiet strength in his stance, the readiness that was always just beneath the surface. We stay, she said, her voice clear and resolute. Silas met her gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his ice-colored eyes. Acknowledgement, respect, partnership. They spent the next day preparing, silent and focused. Silas showed her how to reinforce the door, how to use the rifle, though the kick sent a jolt through her still-healing arm. Alara, in turn, identified weaknesses in the cabin structure, suggesting ways to block sightlines and funnel approach. Her mind, once lost in trauma, was sharp and analytical, honed by observation and necessity. The men arrived 2 days later, just after dawn. 2 figures on horseback, dark shapes against the melting snow. They approached cautiously, circling the cabin. Silas stood by the reinforced door, rifle in hand. Alara was by the window, hidden from view, the small axe clutched in her hand, her heart pounding a steady, strong beat against her ribs. It wasn't the frantic rabbit thump of fear anymore, but the powerful rhythm of adrenaline and determination. One of the men dismounted, calling out, "We know you're in there. We just want the woman." His voice was rough, demanding. Silas didn't respond. The man took a step closer. Alara felt a surge of cold fury, not fear. They thought she was prey. She wasn't anymore. The man moved towards the door. Silas raised his rifle. "Get back," he warned, his voice low but carrying authority. The man hesitated, then laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Fool, you think you can stop us?" He drew a pistol. It happened fast. Silas fired, not at the man, but into the ground near his feet, kicking up dirt and snow. The loud crack echoed, startling the horses. The man stumbled back, surprised but unharmed. His companion on horseback drew his own weapon. Before either could react further, Alara threw open the window and screamed, a raw, primal sound that was not fear, but defiance. "Get out! You want her? You'll have to take her." She raised the axe, not in a threat she could likely back up, but as a symbol of her refusal to be hunted silently anymore. The sheer, unexpected ferocity of her cry, coupled with Silas's warning shot and their obvious preparedness, gave the men pause. They hadn't expected resistance, certainly not from their intended victim. They exchanged a look. The storm had passed, but the wilderness was still vast and unforgiving. Pushing this might be more trouble than she was worth, not with a man like Silas standing guard and the woman herself spitting fire. After a tense moment, they turned their horses and rode away, back the way they came, swallowed once more by the landscape. The silence that followed was profound. Alara lowered the axe, her arms trembling now with the aftermath of adrenaline. She looked at Silas, who lowered his rifle, his gaze steady. There were no triumphant words, no congratulations. Just the quiet understanding that they had faced the threat together and endured. The danger might not be permanently gone, but for today, they had stood their ground. The woman who had been pulled from the snowdrift, broken and terrified, was gone. In her place stood a woman scarred but whole, resilient and strong, no longer defined by what had been done to her, but by her refusal to be defeated. Her journey had been won through darkness, guided by the quiet presence of a man who saw not just a victim, but the flicker of a spirit refusing to be extinguished. He had offered shelter, protection, and the silent space she needed to mend. She, in turn, had found a strength she never knew she possessed, a resilience that had been buried beneath trauma. Their paths, brought together by chance and circumstance, were now intertwined, a testament to the unexpected bonds forged in the crucible of survival, a quiet partnership built on shared hardship and unspoken respect. The wilderness remained vast and challenging, but they faced it not as isolated figures, but together, two quiet souls who had found not just refuge, but a measure of peace and purpose in the heart of the storm.